Hello and welcome to 25 Concepts in Anthropology, where I, Nick Herriman, take you through what I think are the most important 25 concepts in contemporary socio-cultural anthropology. Today I want to talk about mode of production. Mode of production. What I'm particularly interested in is an idea which is called the dialectic. The dialectic. This idea is associated with Marxist anthropology. And it's basically an explanation of the history of civilization as we know it. The ideas I'm going to present to you today are rather crude in the form I present them, and I'm only explaining them to you because they form a kind of important backdrop to the Marxist/class understanding of history, which lies behind not only anthropology but sociology, history and some other disciplines too. So I should say also the ideas I'm going to talk about today are not strictly speaking Marx's idea, not strictly speaking what Karl Marx wrote, but rather Marxist. By that I mean our interpretation of Marx. So let's start at the very beginning. According to Marx, the earliest sort of social structure for humans was primitive communism. So thousands of years ago, according to Marx, and Marx was no great archaeologist, but nevertheless he posited that primitive communism was the first form of society. And he would, for example, see that, or a Marxist might see primitive communism in contemporary hunter-gathering societies. So the mode of production, if you like, we could say that the economic base, and using a Marxist approach, we can see every society as having an economic base, as social structure, and what's sometimes called superstructure. This is basically what you do for a living, economic base. Structure is how you organize your society, and superstructure is basically your beliefs. So for a primitive communist society, we could say it's a hunter-gatherer society. The structure is basically one of equality. So we'll say hunter-gatherer. The structure is basically equality. Men hunt, women gather, but aside from that it's relatively equal. I'll just move you a bit over. Equality, and there's no private property. So everything is owned by everybody, if you like. There's no sense of, or even better, there's no sense of ownership. This is the first stage of what we call the dialectic. Now, at some point, according to a Marxist history, there will be a development through war of property. People will start to possess other people, that is, slaves, and they'll also begin to possess private property. Now, by private property we don't mean things like your watch or your glasses, things like that, but particularly what we're referring to are things that you can use to produce more property. So, for example, a windmill allows you to produce more grain, or a slave allows you to produce more grain again. Alright, so what do you think the next stage will be? We've got slaves, and on top of the slaves we'll have citizens. And this is characteristic of what, in a Marxist approach, we call the ancient mode of production. So this one was primitive. This one is the ancient mode of production. I have to move you a bit closer to see if you can get this. Primitive and ancient. So we start at primitive, We go over to the ancient. So this is the first step, if you like, in the dialectic or the mode of production. Now, from the ancient mode, we move to the next. Before we move, I should go through the economic base. The economic base is slavery. It's based on slavery. Economic base is slavery. The structure, again, is citizens and slaves. And the superstructure are the beliefs. So beliefs, for example, in a pantheon of gods. So that's the ancient mode of production. Apologies for the very poor production values here. Okay, so we've moved from primitive to ancient. Now, our next step, I'm going to have to erase this, so remember this model. Whenever you're thinking about a society, it's not too bad to think about economic base, structure, and superstructure. As a way of analysing societies, it's a very crude but quick way of understanding and categorising societies. And anthropologists have to be familiar with many societies, so don't feel too bad if you need to be somewhat crude in your approach at times. Okay, so we've got to the ancient. Now the idea is that from this mode of production, the ancient mode of production, there will be eventually a revolution, a dialectic. Now to put it in 19th century terms, you have a thesis, an antithesis, and when they get together you get a new synthesis, which will move us to the next mode of production. The next mode of production, which will be what happened after the ancient, after the collapse of Rome and Greece. We move to the next stage, which is the feudal mode of production. Now, what is the base of this is serfs producing grains, pigs, etc., and artisans for the lords. Okay, so what this is if you think that's the economic base, is these people producing food, etc., and also surplus for lords. By the way, as far as surplus is concerned, surplus only becomes a form of social distinction in the ancient mode of production, and then it continues on now into our feudal mode of production. So if the ancient was Rome, the feudal will now move into, for example, medieval Europe, and we have lords and serfs. Now, this gives way around about, well, let's just say the feudal period, very roughly, collapse of Rome, what's got to 300, I can't remember, but let's say circa 300 to 1500 is the feudal period. This will give way to the next period, and I'm running out of space, I realise. I was very extravagant to start with. The next period will be the modern bourgeois or capitalist period. Now, in this period, there are two important classes. The bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, plantations, mines, and factories, and the people who work in the plantations and mines and factories, which is the proletariat. These are the two most important classes. Okay, these will, from this thesis and antithesis, there will be another synthesis according to Marx, and that will be communism. And unfortunately, I've run out of space, so a communist. Go right over here. Communist. And that will will be a society of equality. From each, according to Marx, his ability, and to each, according to Marx, their needs. From each, according to his ability, and to each, according to his needs. So we'll get back to the basic structure that characterized primitive communism. Okay, so this is a description of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 modes of production which progress through a process called the dialectic. The dialectic is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. However, according to Marx, this only applies to the West. In Asia, that is the Orient, another mode of production exists. According to Marx, a timeless mode of production that never changes. I don't have time to critique this, it's been thoroughly critiqued, but let's just say all of this is subject to critique, and all of the concepts I've talked about in this 25 concept series are subject to strident critique. Nevertheless, they're all quite useful in their own ways. So returning to this, we've got, as far as modes of production, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In Asia, we have another mode which continues through time. There's no dialectic really in Asia. In Asia, there's just one mode of production, and we could call that Oriental Despotism. And the idea here is, with Oriental Despotism, the idea here is that it's unchanging through time. And its characteristic is a great leader, an emperor, who's a despot, who owns all the property, and everybody works for him. And a famous anthropologist by the name of Wittfogel, again, who was subsequently critiqued heavily, but anyway, a famous anthropologist by the name of Wittfogel suggested that actually this is understandable because in Asia lots of irrigation was required, especially for rice, which you need a supreme leader in order to mobilize a lot of labor, and the supreme leader will take all the surplus, all the excess rice, let's say, as a way of increasing his power. So there you have it, the mode of production. I've explained to you that these basic ideas, I've got to say I've done it in a very crude way, a very simplistic way. It needs a lot more complexity and sophistication, and that's what you get when you come to university and study these things in more detail. I have to say, of all the concepts, this is probably the one that's least used in anthropology. You won't see in many contemporary anthropological journals the term mode of production. But what you do find is this underlies a lot of analysis, as I said, in anthropology and in other disciplines. Thank you for your time today. I hope you stay tuned for some more 25 concepts in anthropology.